The pie was still warm when Della Crane crossed the fence line. She carried it with both hands, the way her mother had taught her, level, steady, no matter what the ground beneath your boots decided to do. The crust had gone golden in the oven that morning, the kind of gold that only happens when the lard is cold and the hands working it are patient. Inside, the apples from her east-facing tree, the ones that caught the first light every day and never quite knew what bitterness was, had softened into something close to grace. The November air out on the Cimarron Flats had teeth. It bit at the back of her neck, slid under her collar, reminded her that winter in this part of New Mexico territory did not negotiate. The grass was the color of old straw. The sky above the mesa was a hard, hammered blue that gave nothing back. Somewhere to the north, a hawk was making long, patient circles above something that had already died. She could see Abel Marsh's place from her kitchen window every morning, and for the past 6 weeks, she'd watched it the way you watch a fire that's going out. The chimney had stopped smoking by mid-October. The garden gate had been hanging open since the first frost. His horse, a brindle roan named Captain, stood in the paddock each morning with his head low, as if the animal himself had absorbed the grief of the house. Abel Marsh had lost his wife, Clara, to the fever in late September. He had 2 children. A boy named Thomas, 9 years old, who used to wave at Della across the fence when she hung her washing. And a girl named Ruth, 6, who had her mother's dark red hair and her father's habit of going very still when she was thinking hard about something. Della had given them time because she understood what it meant to need it. She'd lost her own husband, Garrett, 3 years prior, not to sickness but to a horse that didn't forgive a moment's carelessness. She knew the specific texture of early grief. How it felt like river clay, heavy and shapeless, pressing against your chest from the inside. How the world kept making sounds, wind, roosters, wagon wheels on the road, and those sounds felt like an insult. 6 weeks was long enough. She pushed through the gate and walked toward the house. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. She knocked twice, the way neighbors do, not loud enough to startle, but firm enough to mean something. It was Thomas who answered, and the sight of him nearly broke her in half. He'd grown thin in a way that children should not grow thin, the kind of thin that comes not from running and playing but from forgetting to eat. His shirt was misbuttoned, the third button pushed through the second hole, creating a small, crooked pull in the fabric that nobody had noticed or corrected. His eyes were too old for his face. "Mrs. Crane," he said. Not unfriendly, but careful. The way children get when they've learned that the world does not deal gently. "Thomas." She lifted the pie a quarter inch so he could see it. "I baked this morning. Made more than I can use." The lie was kind and both of them knew it. He stepped back and let her in, and the house told her everything she needed to know in the first 3 seconds. It was not a filthy house, Abel Marsh was not that kind of man, but it was a house that had stopped being cared for. The kind of stop that comes from exhaustion so deep it turns into a fog. There were dishes in the dry sink that had been washed and stacked but never put away. A pot on the cold stove still held the grey residue of something boiled too long and too plain. Ruth's coat hung on the wrong hook, the one meant for company, because the right one had Clara's wool shawl on it and nobody had the heart to move it. The shawl was still there. Della saw it and looked away quickly, the way you look away from someone else's wound. Abel was at the table. He had his hands around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold, and he was looking at the cup the way a man looks at something he's stopped seeing. He raised his eyes when she came in, and there was a half-second of naked shame on his face, the shame of being seen inside your own collapse, before he got himself arranged. "Della," he said. "Abel." She set the pie on the table without ceremony. "You need a fire. It's colder in here than outside." He said nothing to argue, which told her how far gone he was. In better days, Abel Marsh was not a man who accepted critique without a quiet, good-natured rebuttal. She went to the wood box. It was nearly empty. She went outside without a word, found the splitting block around the side of the house, and spent 20 minutes at the axe. She was not a small woman, and the work of 3 years running a ranch alone had put real strength in her shoulders. The wood split clean. Thomas came out after the third swing and watched her for a moment, then picked up the pieces she'd made and carried them inside without being asked. That was when she knew he was going to be all right. The ones who are going to be all right find a way to be useful even when they're breaking. She built the fire herself, coaxed it up from the cold stone of the fireplace with old newspaper and patience. While it caught, she went to work in the kitchen. She found flour, a little fatback, some dried beans that had been soaking too long in water gone cloudy. She poured the beans out and started fresh. There were 3 potatoes in the bin. There was half an onion wrapped in cloth, dried at the edges but still good at the center. Ruth appeared from the back room sometime in the middle of all this, drawn by the smell of things actually cooking. She stood in the doorway with bare feet on the cold floorboards and a cloth rabbit pressed against her chest, and she didn't say anything. She just watched Della's hands. "You want to help me with these potatoes?" Della asked, not looking up, keeping her voice casual as a Sunday afternoon. Ruth considered this for a moment of great seriousness. Then she padded across the floor and climbed up on the stool beside the dry sink. Della handed her a rag and showed her how to scrub the skin without breaking it. Ruth worked with absolute concentration, the cloth rabbit tucked under one arm, her small tongue just visible at the corner of her mouth. Abel came to the kitchen doorway after a while. He'd combed his hair. He'd done up the buttons on his shirt. These small corrections were enormous and Della pretended not to notice them. "You don't have to do all this," he said. "I know it." She stirred the pot. "Hand me that pepper, would you?" He handed it over and didn't leave the doorway, and they stayed like that, her at the stove, him at the door, Ruth on her stool. Thomas coming in and out between them like a shuttle on a loom, while the smell of onions and beans and wood smoke filled the house up and pushed some of the cold out. They ate at the table with the oil lamp burning between them. The beans were good. The potatoes had crisped in the cast iron. Della had found a heel of cornbread in the back of the bread box, 3 days old but salvageable, cut thin and warmed on the skillet. Ruth ate 2 full portions, systematic and quiet. Thomas ate 3, and looked briefly ashamed about it, and then ate a 4th because hunger is stronger than shame in the end. Abel cut 2 pieces of the apple pie and gave both of them to the children. "That was for you as well," Della said. "I'll eat the rest," he said, and cut himself the thinnest sliver left. "I haven't had much appetite." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept properly in 6 weeks and knew it and could not fix it. "She used to make apple pie," he said. "It came out quiet. Not intended to wound, not intended to draw pity. Just a fact offered like a stone placed carefully on a table." "I know," Della said. "Clara's was better than mine. Hers had more cinnamon." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape one makes when it's been a long time and the muscles are remembering. "That's true," he said. It did. She did not make it a habit of visiting every day, because she understood that presence, like medicine, can be overdone. But she came every few days through November, and each time the house was a little less like a place where something had stopped. The shawl eventually came down from the wrong hook. She noticed it one morning on the correct hook, where it had always been. In the spot Clara had chosen for it, and this told her Abel had found some private hour of courage to do that rearranging. She taught Ruth to make biscuits on a Tuesday morning when the wind was blowing hard enough to rattle the window glass. Ruth's first attempt came out like small rocks, which delighted Thomas, who immediately tried to use one to drive a nail into the fence post and discovered the biscuit won. Abel had to turn away and walk to the far side of the yard to recover himself, and when he came back his eyes were red but he was composed, and he put his hands on both children's heads and said, "Your mother would have laughed so hard at that." It was the first time Della had heard him say your mother in the present tense of love rather than the past tense of loss. She set Thomas to hauling water while she and Ruth started on a second batch of biscuits. She kept her instructions simple and even, the way she'd learned to talk to herself in the early dark mornings after Garrett died. When the voice in your own head has to be steadier than you actually feel. Thomas, for his part, had taken it upon himself to fix things. He'd found a loose board on the porch step and had been worrying at it with a hammer for the better part of a week. He had his father's hands, wide-palmed, methodical, and he approached the nail with the seriousness of a man 3 times his age. When Della came over one morning and found the board secured and solid, she stopped and pressed her boot down on it twice to test it. "Good work," she said. Thomas shrugged with enormous effort, as if he'd spent considerable energy pretending it was nothing. Abel had begun to work the ranch again in a real way. She could hear him at the fence line some mornings, the ring of the hammer carrying clean and purposeful across the flat. Captain, the roan, had his head up again. 40 miles south, on the far side of the Rayton Ridge where the cedars grew low and bitter-smelling, a man named Harlan Schofield had been making inquiries. He was the younger brother of Clara's first intended, a man from a good family, or what passed for a good family in that part of the territory. Which meant they had land and lawyers and the low cunning that substitutes for character in men who have never needed to develop any. Clara had broken her engagement to the first Schofield boy in the spring of 1871 to marry Abel Marsh. A decision that had been neither forgiven nor forgotten by the Schofield family in the decade and a half since. Harlan was not the older brother. He was the crueler one. He had been in Texas when Clara died, running a small but profitable enterprise involving cattle that bore freshly altered brands. When word reached him, by letter, from an old family friend in Mora County, that Clara Marsh was dead and that Abel Marsh was sitting on 160 acres of excellent grazing land with no clear male heir. Harlan had sold his horse, bought a better one, and begun to ride north. He stopped in each town along the way. He drank moderately. He asked questions with an air of casual grief, framing himself as a concerned family relation, an old friend of the family coming to pay respects. He asked about the condition of the land. About whether Abel had filed his deed properly. About whether there was any other woman in the picture. He was 3 towns south of Cimarron by late November. A man at the Rayton relay station told him what he'd heard from a trader who'd been through the area recently, that the Marsh widower had a neighbor woman coming around regular. A widow herself. Name of Crane. Harlan filed that information away with the rest. The first Friday of December, Della drove her wagon into Cimarron for supplies, and Abel loaded his own wagon the same morning and came with her. With the children in the back between the empty crates. It was the first time he'd been into town since the funeral. Main Street in Cimarron in December had a pinched, suspicious quality to it, the cold driving everyone toward the stoves of the general store and the saloon, creating proximity that bred opinion. Della had lived here for 7 years and she understood the social architecture of the town the way she understood the layout of her own kitchen, where things were kept. What happened if you moved them? She knew before she climbed down from the wagon that talk had been made. Mrs. Edna Pruitt was the first sign. Edna stood in front of Dillard's general store in her good coat, which she wore even on ordinary days because ordinary days were the ones worth impressing. And she watched Della and Abel's wagons pull up with an expression so carefully arranged into concern that only a woman could read how much judgment was underneath it. "Abel," Edna said, stepping forward. "We've been thinking about you." The whole congregation. Her eye slid to Della and came back. "And of course Mrs. Crane has been helpful." The word helpful arrived weighted. A stone dropped into water with intentions behind it. Abel looked at Edna Pruitt the way a man looks at a weather system he's seen before. "She has," he said, and offered nothing more. Thomas helped Ruth down from the wagon and took her hand without being told, and Della felt the old familiar warmth she always felt when the boy did something quietly right. Inside Dillard's, while Abel talked to the store clerk about a new axle pin he needed, Della gathered her flour and meal and salt. She was at the back counter pricing out coffee when she became aware of 2 women talking in the fabric section, their voices low but carrying the way low voices in small rooms always do. "Going over there 3, 4 times a week, they say," the children being used as an excuse, if you ask me, are barely a season past poor Clara. God rest her, Della set her coffee tin on the counter with a sound that was not loud but was precise, and the talking stopped. She finished her transaction without turning around. It was Reverend Aldous Biggs, however, who escalated things past the level of whisper. She was loading her wagon when he appeared beside her, a man who wore righteousness like a coat he never took off regardless of the temperature. "Mrs. Crane," he said. "A private word." She kept stacking. "You can say what you mean to say right here, Reverend." He cleared his throat. He was a man who needed the stage arrangement of his office and his pulpit and his height advantage over a seated congregation in order to feel fully authorized. "There is some concern," he began, "among the Christian families of this community." "Whose concern?" she said. "Specifically." He recalibrated. "The concern being that your frequent presence in a widower's home, unchaperoned, sends a message that someone brought a man and his children a meal," she said, "and helped keep them from going to ruin inside their own grief." "Mrs. Crane, my husband is 3 years dead," she said. "I run my ranch alone. I pay my taxes. My reputation was built in this town one honest day at a time. And I will not diminish it by standing here and apologizing for baking a pie." She lifted the last crate and set it in the wagon and turned to face him directly. She was not a tall woman, but she had the quality of stillness that commands a space. "The question you should be asking yourself, Reverend, is what this community was doing for Abel Marsh's children these past 6 weeks. Because I did not see any covered dishes from any Christian families coming over that fence line." Biggs opened his mouth and found it empty. Abel appeared at her elbow then. He had heard enough. His face was quiet in the way that mountain weather is quiet before it commits to something. "Reverend," he said. "Abel, I know what you were only." His voice was not raised. A raised voice would have been easier to dismiss. This was lower, and more certain. "Della Crane is my neighbor. She has helped my children. If there is something in that which troubles the congregation, I am happy to discuss it at a time and in a place of your choosing. But not here and not like this." Biggs nodded once, in the particular way men nod when they are retreating but need it to look like something else, and departed. Della finished loading the wagon. She did not look at Abel. "You didn't have to do that," she said, quietly. "No," he agreed. "I didn't have to." He went around to his own wagon and started up the team, and Ruth climbed up beside Della on the seat and pressed herself against her arm. And Della put one hand on the reins and clicked her tongue and drove them home. Harlan Schofield arrived in Cimarron on a Wednesday, which he chose deliberately because Wednesdays were when men of business came and went without attracting the attention that a Friday or Saturday arrival might generate. He took a room at the Territorial Hotel. He ate his supper without speaking to anyone. He slept. In the morning he went to the county land office and spent 2 hours with the clerk going over recorded deeds, asking questions that sounded administrative and were anything but. Abel's deed was in order. The land was his outright, 160 acres, filed correctly under the homestead provisions, no liens, no challenges. Harlan absorbed this without expression and thanked the clerk pleasantly. Then he went to the saloon and found a man named Yates, who was the kind of man every town has and every town needs to remove. And he had a quiet conversation over 2 glasses of whiskey about the value of reconnaissance and the further value of discretion. Yates had small, colorless eyes and hands that were permanently dirty in the manner of a man whose work is always slightly shameful. He listened. He nodded. He named a price. Harlan paid half in advance. 3 nights after the confrontation with Biggs, Della woke to Captain screaming. She had slept lightly since Garrett died, a habit of survival that her body had adopted and refused to relinquish. She was out of bed and had the rifle down from above the door before the second cry from the horse had fully faded. She went to the window. The moon was 3/4 full and the flat was silver white and hard. She could see her fence line and, beyond it, Abel's paddock. Captain was at the far end, pressed into the corner, his shape black and agitated against the pale ground. There was a figure at Abel's barn. Not Abel. Abel was a big man and this figure was not built the same way, and it moved with the specific carefulness of someone who does not want to be heard. Which is a different thing entirely from someone who belongs in a place. She dressed in 60 seconds flat. Boots, coat, no lamp. She went out the back and around the long way, staying in the shadow of her own fence line and then cutting south through the dry creek bed that ran between the two properties. The creek bed kept her below the sight line of anyone standing at the barn. She came up on the east side of Abel's barn, upwind of the horses, and stopped there in the dark and listened. The figure was at the barn door. He was doing something with the latch, she could hear the soft scrape of metal, and he had a small dark lantern with the slide nearly closed, putting out just enough light to work by. Della raised the rifle. "Step away from that door," she said. Her voice was level. It did not carry further than it needed to. The figure went still in the complete way that only surprise produces. "Step away and keep your hands where the moon can see them," she said. He stepped away. His hands came up. He was a medium-built man with a hat pulled low, and even in the dimness she could see he had the look of someone whose value is borrowed from someone else's authority. The farmhouse door opened and Abel came out, and he had his own rifle and a lamp. "Yates," Abel said, holding the lamp up. There was recognition in his voice, the weary recognition of a man who has identified a pattern he was hoping wouldn't materialize. The man said nothing. Abel looked at Della across the space between them, and in the lamplight she could see that he was not surprised, exactly. He'd been expecting something. He just hadn't expected it to announce itself at 2 in the morning. "Thomas," Abel called back toward the house. "Sir." The boy's voice from inside, wide awake. He'd been awake the whole time, Della suspected. "Get the rope from the tack room." They tied Yates to the paddock fence and sat with him until morning, Abel on one side, Della on the other, neither of them speaking much. The cold working steadily at all three of them though with different intentions. The stars moved in their old, indifferent arc overhead. Captain settled eventually and stood close to Abel's side of the fence, blowing warm air that rose and vanished. At some point in the long middle of the night, Abel said, "He's Schofield's man." "I know," Della said. A long pause. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since I heard a Schofield had been through Rayton asking after your deed." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't say anything." "I wasn't sure yet. Didn't want to put a trouble in your house before it arrived on its own." He looked at her across the tired, shivering, humiliated figure of Yates. "Della," he said, "I am going to ask you something and I need you not to run it through any of the usual politeness before you answer." She waited. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Not of Schofield," she said. "No." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Good," he said. They said nothing more for a while. Ruth came out sometime before first light with 2 cups of coffee, her coat on over her nightdress. Her feet in her mother's old boots that were 3 sizes too large and required her to shuffle to keep them on. She handed a cup to her father and one to Della and shuffled back inside without a word. Della wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out at the flat, where the darkness was just beginning to thin at the eastern edge. She had made a decision somewhere in the middle of that night, in the silence between words. She had made it quietly, the way the important ones are always made, without announcement or drama, the way water decides to go around a stone rather than through it, not from weakness, but from the wisdom of its own nature. She would not leave these people to face this alone. They rode into Cimarron at first light with Yates in the back of Abel's wagon. And Abel Marsh walked Yates through the front door of the sheriff's office and set him down in front of Sheriff Cord Mabry with the particular quietness of a man delivering a package he is glad to be rid of. Yates, for his part, had spent the night losing his nerve by degrees, and by morning he had very little left and a clear calculation to make. He chose the calculation that men of borrowed authority always choose when the authority is no longer present. He told what he knew. By noon, there was a warrant written for Harlan Schofield on the charge of conspiracy to commit trespass and property interference, not the most severe charges available. But Mabry was a practical man, and practical charges stick where dramatic ones slide off. Harlan Schofield, it turned out, was still at the Territorial Hotel, a decision that spoke to an overconfidence so complete it had become a kind of stupidity. He was at breakfast when Mabry and his deputy walked in. And he sat there with his napkin across his knee and a very expensive composure on his face, and said that he was merely a concerned family friend who had come to offer his respects, and that any accusations were a fiction and a slander. Mabry said that was fine, and invited him to explain the fiction to the circuit judge, who came through Cimarron every third week and was due in 11 days. Schofield spent those 11 days in a cell that smelled of pine tar and previous occupants, and his composure departed by the third morning. It was in those 11 days that Abel Marsh came to Della's door for the first time rather than the other way around. He came on a Sunday afternoon when the light was the color of old honey and even the wind had taken a day off. He had combed his hair and he held his hat in his hands in the manner of a man who is not accustomed to uncertainty and is uncertain. "Come in," she said, standing back. He came in and stood in her kitchen, which was warm from the morning's baking, and looked around at her things, the copper pans, the braided rug, the shelf of small books. The way she had arranged the dry goods in descending order of how often she used them. "This is a good house," he said. "It's been a good house to me." He turned his hat once in his hands. "Della," he said. "Abel. I have been thinking about what Biggs said. And what the town will continue to say." He paused. "And I have been thinking about Schofield, and what a man like that looks for when he goes looking." "A weakness," she said. "A gap," he said. "A place where something should be and isn't. A deed in one person's name. A widow without protection. A widower without—" He stopped. "Without a partner," she said. He looked at her. "Without a partner." "Yes." The word sat between them. They both understood what it contained and what it implied and what the practical weight of it was, and they also both understood, without needing to say it, that the conversation was about more than strategy. "Now," she said carefully. "You're about to say something." "I am." He took a breath. "I was thinking that if we were to file your property and mine under a joint deed, as neighbors with a formal legal arrangement, it would give Schofield nothing to pick at. The law in this territory recognizes cooperative land arrangements. It's not unheard of." "It's not the arrangement you mean," she said. He was quiet. "Abel." She kept her voice even. "If you are going to say what I think you are going to say it plainly. I've got no patience for going around things." He looked at her then, fully and directly. And the nakedness in it was not the nakedness of weakness but the nakedness of a man who has finally stopped protecting himself long enough to look at the truth of his own life. "I am 47 years old," he said. "I loved Clara. I will love her until I am in the ground alongside her, and I will not pretend otherwise." He paused. "But my children need a home that is whole. And I have sat across the table from you in the morning light more times than I can count," and he stopped. His jaw worked. "And if I were 20 years younger, I would not be standing here with my hat in my hands trying to make this sound like a practical matter." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark made one clear note and stopped. Della looked at the floor for a moment, then looked at him. "You are not 20 years younger," she said. "And neither am I." "No. But you are here." "I am." "And your children," she stopped, and there was something in her face that she let him see for just a moment. The full measure of what those two children had come to mean to her in the months of biscuits and hammered nails and cold coffee and shared firelight. "Your children need someone who will not leave." "They do," he said. "And you need," she looked at him steadily. "You need someone who will stand on the other side of the fence in the dark with a rifle and not be afraid." He almost smiled. Not quite. But the shape of it was there. I do, he said. As it appears, I need exactly that. She was quiet for a moment. That was not an uncertain moment but a considered one, the way a woman who has survived alone for 3 years gets to consider things. From her own strength and her own counsel. Then we will go see the land clerk, she said. And we will do this in order. And we will let the town say what it says and take the time it needs and come around when it comes around. He put his hat back on. I will speak to Reverend Biggs, he said. Let me speak to Biggs, she said. He needs a different approach. She did speak to Biggs. She came to his office on a Tuesday and she sat across from him and spoke for 20 minutes in a voice so measured and reasonable and quietly inexorable that by the end of it Biggs had discovered, to his own mild surprise, that he had been in favor of the arrangement all along and had perhaps been misunderstood. Edna Pruitt took somewhat longer, but Edna Pruitt was not an unkind woman beneath the good coat and the arranged expressions. And she was moved, genuinely and visibly moved, when Ruth Marsh came to her door one afternoon with a jar of Della's apple preserves and said, with great seriousness, Mrs. Crane said these are for you, because you don't have anyone to cook for you either. Edna took the jar and held it with both hands and cried a little, and after that she was the one who told people, firmly, that the Marsh and Crane business was a fine thing and anybody who suggested otherwise could discuss it with her personally. The circuit judge arrived on a Thursday. The hearing regarding Harlan Schofield lasted 2 hours. Schofield's lawyer argued the charges were circumstantial. The judge considered the testimony of Yates, who had written out his account in full and signed it with a hand that shook only slightly. The judge was a compact, dry-voiced man from Santa Fe who had seen 20 years of exactly this kind of predatory land maneuvering and had developed an allergy to it. He found for the county on all charges. Schofield was fined, bound over, and escorted to the territorial line with a clarity about what would happen if he returned that the judge delivered in one quiet sentence that required no repetition. Abel and Della were in the courtroom. They sat in the second row, Thomas beside Abel, Ruth beside Della, and Ruth held Della's hand throughout the proceedings with the matter-of-fact grip of a child who has decided where her anchor is. When it was done, they walked out into the December afternoon. The cold was honest and clean. The mountains to the west had new snow on them, white and unreachable and permanent. Thomas looked up at the mountains for a long moment. "Can we go home now?" he said. "Yes," Abel said. "We can go home." Della said nothing. She adjusted the collar of Ruth's coat, which had gone crooked, and took the girl's hand again, and they walked toward the wagons together, the four of them. Through the cold clear air of a day that was ending well. They married in February, before the thaw, in Reverend Biggs's church with the whole of Cimarron present because the whole of Cimarron had decided, collectively, that this was a thing to attend. There was no elaborate ceremony. Della wore her good blue dress. Abel wore the dark coat he'd been married in the first time, which she had pressed herself the night before, carefully, without sentiment and without resentment. Because she understood that a life contains more than one chapter and that a woman who is worth something can hold space for both. Thomas stood beside his father. Ruth stood beside Della and held the cloth rabbit under one arm for comfort, though she no longer needed it quite as much as she once had. The land was filed jointly before the wedding. The deed read Marsh and Crane, and then simply Marsh, and the lines on the map that had once divided the two properties were redrawn as one piece. 160 acres meeting another 160 acres across the old fence line, a fence they took down that first spring, saving the good posts and burning the rest for warmth. The pie had started it. That was the thing Della thought about sometimes on winter mornings when she looked out from the kitchen window, her kitchen now, or their kitchen now. Which was a better way to say it, across the flat land to where the fence line used to be. A pie carried level, with cold-worked crust and patient hands, across a boundary she might never have crossed otherwise. Broken places do not always stay broken. Sometimes what looks like a ruin is only a space being cleared for the next thing. The land does not grieve its own winters. It stores whatever warmth it can in its lowest depths, and holds it through the dark months, and spends it upward in the spring without apology. That is the way of things that are going to last. That is the way she found the February morning she crossed that fence line with a pie still warm in her hands, and did not go back alone.